Hello, team, and welcome back to Live, Perform, Compete podcast. It has been a while since we've had a guest on the show. Things have been a little bit crazy and busy here in Hong Kong, but I'm sure they have around the rest of the world. But I'm stoked today to introduce our guest. His name is Kasper Vinter. Have I said that well, Kasper? Kasper, he is the owner of Nordic Performance Training over in Denmark. We're going to get into his story in a second in terms of how we cross paths. But Kasper was originally kind of got into this field as a physiotherapist, but now he is a personal trainer, strength and conditioning coach. Kasper, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ed.
Kasper, I guess the first question to kind of introduce you to our listeners, what exactly is it that you do? And what is it that brought you to doing what you do?
Yeah, so as you said, I'm currently the co-owner and founder of Nordic Performance Training, and we just specialize in personal training and physical therapy for all levels of athletes and general population clients. And I am, from an educational standpoint, I'm a physical therapist and done a lot of sports physio education. And throughout the week, I'm just coaching clients and running the gym, doing online programming and coaching for my clients, and venturing into some mentorship style stuff. But what I started to work with, like the reason we're here probably is because I started to work with some CrossFitters and started to, so that sparked your interest in what we're doing. But normally I just work with general population and more athletes of all levels.
So yeah, I mean, that's exactly kind of where we'll go next, which is kind of how I found you, Kasper, was Andre Houdet, who has been a guest on the podcast, who is, just on a whirlwind journey right now, making it to the top, chasing his dreams to get to CrossFit Games. Someone who is always kind of experimenting with different protocols to get better at the sport. And kind of most recently, he's set up this amazing home gym now in Denmark. But I kept on seeing your name pop up on his Instagram stories and in his posts. And, kind of unlike most CrossFitters, who typically train using a barbell, dumbbells, bench, assault bike, and rower, I started to see Andre incorporating a lot of kind of machine-based work. So, you could call it bodybuilding, you can call it isolated work, but he was definitely incorporating a lot more of it into his training. But also tying with those posts, just the massive improvements he seemed to make in terms of body composition, muscle mass that he's put on, but also in terms of his strength numbers. And he's already a strong dude. To see him still making progress, makes people kind of question, I wonder what he's doing that's actually working. So, that's where I kind of stumbled across your Instagram page and kind of started looking at stuff and content you were posting, which I love. Definitely kind of hits home to me, and more so in my early years before I kind of got into CrossFit. I was under the tutelage of the Charles Poliquin and the Poliquin group in terms of the way that they would lay out strength and conditioning. And so to see it now being kind of applied into CrossFitters over there in Scandinavia is just really cool. I have to say, I've learned a lot from your posts as well. So I'd love to dig into some of that content. I have to ask before we get there though, with a lot of the stuff you're doing, where did you learn that from? Did you have any mentors in strength and conditioning that kind of taught you some of the stuff that you're doing now?
So I've always been interested in strength and conditioning and following like guys like Charles Poliquin and the Poliquin group on that kind of stuff. And I started to get more and more interested in just learning about biomechanics and muscle physiology, as well as the physical therapy side. So I normally use a periodization model, which is like made from a guy like Kasper Vinter from N1 Education. And I try to stay up to date with guys like Chris Beersley, who does strength and training research, as well as like knowledgeable and accomplished physios like Adam Meekins and Greg DeLayman, who are constantly like challenging a lot of the biases we have. Also, if you've been doing a lot of Poliquin style stuff, there are a lot of great things, but also sometimes what we now could call more pseudoscientific maybe. But he laid out the foundation to where a lot of knowledgeable people could work from there and make just like Kasper Hansen had made a new in-one periodization model. So that's often I use his way of periodization, the training for my athletes, which is kind of new for most of them. So yeah, so that's where I learned a lot about biomechanics and strength training for those names. And then from my background as a physical therapist working with clients at all levels, and also studying some strength and conditioning specialization books. I wanted to take the CSCS, but COVID stopped me from doing that. So I had a lot of background, basic knowledge, and then I started to learn more from different specialists in the field.
Awesome.
That's mine. Yeah.
So what does your role look like right now? I mean, we have a lot of the athletes like Andre who are prepping for semifinals right now. You know, so they may be going into kind of more of a competition prep phase, but I know certainly the last few months you've been really hands-on with those guys. Kind of what has that, you know, when you're working with a high-level CrossFitter who's been training for a long time, you know, elite level strength in many areas, you know, competing in the top 1% of the sport, kind of what has your approach been to those guys? What are some of the stuff you've been incorporating with them?
It's always different from athlete to athlete, because with a guy like Andre, he's very cognitive about what he needs to do, and he knew that he needed to be more have a better structure, more muscle mass, and strength in like the big lifts, and just feel more muscular and ready for everything that's going to get thrown at him. So he was like, just tell me, you make the program, I periodize, and I make the rest of the programming from what I would be doing. So that's so I was really lucky as a coach to be able to have like an athlete that's used to doing his own. He can make his own programming. He has his own programming, no shortcuts. So he's an expert in the field himself. He just wanted to learn how to get stronger, and then he would put the rest of his workouts so it matched the way that I did his programming. Whereas some other athletes, they maybe have a coach who does all the CrossFit specific programming, and I would help to break some plateaus in terms of their strength. So there's two very different ways to go about it. Obviously, being the easiest, obviously being my plan being the primary, and then they would throw things on top of that. So it's very different from athlete to athlete. But as I always tell them in the beginning, I have to look at them as they don't have anything else that they have to do, and then we can adjust from when we go forward from there. Yeah.
So there's two things you mentioned there. One was building muscle and adding muscle to the frame, and the second one was developing strength. And so I think, you know, if we class those into two classification systems, let's call it hypertrophy and absolute strength. Let's start by talking about hypertrophy. So, which is, you know, the general concept of building muscle or adding muscle to an individual's body. What are some of the general protocols? I'd like to keep this specific to the sport of CrossFit, because I think generally speaking, the sport of training, which, you know, essentially all we're doing is training all the time. Still, I think the understanding of how to actually differentiate the approach towards developing top end of strength and versus developing muscle, which are two very different approaches, we tend to get quite wrong. And I think a lot of the confusion comes from the fact that a lot of CrossFitters who just do perhaps generalized CrossFit have a lot of muscle mass on their body anyway. And so we probably get roped into thinking that actually just CrossFit is actually what builds muscle. But of course there are other protocols and other ways to go around it. So, you know, let's talk about hypertrophy to start with. You know, I'd love to, and I'd like you to take this away in any way that you want, but, you know, what are some of the mistakes that we typically make, especially in the CrossFit space? How do you go about, building muscle on an individual, whether they're a beginner or, someone who like Andre, who's been in the sport for a really long time?
Yeah. As you mentioned, a lot of CrossFit athletes, some of them kind of look like pro bodybuilders sometimes, but it's not as much as because they're training specifically for hypertrophy. It's more like it's a byproduct from all the volume that they're doing. That's what I'm thinking. So in terms of hypertrophy, we can look at it more like the sum of all the adaptations we're looking for, and not a specific stress or a stimulus that we put upon our bodies, like when you're doing something more metabolically challenging or neurologically challenging, like specific strength work or high rep CrossFit workouts with a lot of time under tension and not a lot of rest in between. So the primary stress when training solely for hypertrophy, that is what we call mechanical tension, which technically speaking we could call the primary stressor on the body. But the limiting factor will always be all the metabolic buildup or the neurological stress that is happening from all the as a product of all the mechanical tension from our muscle fibers. So in a hypertrophy phase, if we were to say that the primary goal is to build muscle, we are trying to balance somewhere between, if we have like a spectrum, we have metabolic stress and neurological stress on one side, and hypertrophy would be somewhere in between. And depending on where the athlete's qualities are best, we can go in the opposite direction because they're more trainable in that system. Most likely they don't need to do as much work to see hypertrophy gains. So we don't want to go too far to one end of the spectrum, because that would make that the primary thing that are stressing the system and which we would adapt to. And because we're staying away from the extremes, so they don't become the primary limiting factor and the stimulus that the body have to adapt to, the volume of all that mechanical tension that we are applying to the muscle fibers, they become the primary driver for the hypertrophic response. So if you do a lot of workouts as top CrossFitters do, you will have a lot of mechanical tension, and you will see some hypertrophy gains, of course. But when we're training specifically for hypertrophy, we're trying to minimize how much of the byproducts we are applying. So you can almost use a hypertrophy phase as a deload for a CrossFit athlete, which we'll talk about in a minute. Whereas when we talk more strength specific adaptations and everything else, we're still using mechanical tension, of course, but instead of it being the volume of the tension, it is more about how we apply that tension. So now I'm starting to speak about how the difference between specific hypertrophy work and strength work, because training for strength is more about trying to learn our nervous system how to react to certain types of external resistances, not as much as trying to get as much mechanical tension as possible before we cannot lift a heavy weight anymore, or we start to tire out metabolically. And because our brain is constantly learning how to respond to different situations, in the training systems, we as coaches have to create an environment and a situation that will lead to neural adaptations and improvements we're looking for, not on a local level when we're doing hypertrophy work, but more from a neurological standpoint, being able to recruit more motor neurons and so on in a specific way. So that's the primary difference in how I look at hypertrophy work versus strength work. And then we have all the talk about frequency and volume, which in my opinion, sometimes in CrossFit, the frequency may be a little bit too high for the hypertrophy specific work, because most CrossFit athletes are very neurological efficient and very technical in using their muscle as when we learn them how to do it. So yeah, I started to just go out on a tangent there, but I hope that gives you like if you can see the difference between hypertrophy work and strength work, like an overview.
Well, Kasper, I'm the first person to say I love a tangent, but let's quickly define the differences. You know, you talked about neurologically demanding and mechanical, or neurological stress and mechanical stress. Could you quickly give us a quick definition of what we mean by those two things?
So mechanical stress is, or mechanical tension is the amount of force or pull we have between two muscle fibers, like the sarcomeres on if you go down on the lowest level, there's something called the C line between two muscle fibers, and we have like these. When we have tension there, we're signaling to the brain that we need some. They make they're telling us basically just telling our brain that we have to create some more muscle fibers, but we have to have a certain degree or certain volume of mechanical tension for that to happen. So in terms of, you were speaking about protocols for hypertrophy before, we would use something where let's say we have 6 sets and we do a descending rep protocol, for example, 2 sets of 10, 2 sets of 8, 2 sets of 6. The goal here is to start at a higher or a low RPE or high RIR, and then go down towards the end, the last set. So we accumulate a lot of mechanical tension, which are a lot of effective repetitions. As you know, we have between 0 to 4 RIR. Typically, we call that effective reps. But we don't want to die out too early because of too much metabolic buildup or too much neurological stress. So the mechanical tension is just how much force can we generate in the specific muscle fibers, and that varies in terms of how much weight we're using or where in the muscle's active contractile range that we're applying that tension. So we can go very far down a rabbit hole there, but basically speaking, that's what mechanical tension is in terms of the mechanical tension needed for hypertrophy response. Whereas neurological efficiency is all about getting specific neural outcomes and neural adaptations. So being that it can be maximal strength, it can be speed specific, starting strength, explosive strength, reactive strength, all the kind of stuff, which is it's totally different from hypertrophy work because that's more on a local muscle fiber plan than the neurological stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think going back to what you started saying here was that, you know, for hypertrophy, we're looking somewhere between the spectrum of, you know, mechanical tension and neurological tension. So could you talk what that actually looks like in terms of a training protocol? You know, we're trying to find somewhere between the two, not necessarily overloading the neural system, not necessarily overloading the mechanical system. And what mistakes do we typically make? Maybe not just in the CrossFit space when it comes to hypertrophy training. What mistakes do we typically make and what do you see us making?
From what I've been seeing with the athletes I've been talking to and working with, they don't usually do a lot of hypertrophy specific work. It's almost always very specific strength work, almost always maximal strength, and then they have some workouts planned. But for hypertrophy specific like what we call mechanical tension phases or mechanotransduction phase, that would be all about, as we're talking about, building up as much mechanical tension as needed, not more and not any less, which is sometimes we have to do an educated guess based on where the athlete's strength and weaknesses are and what kind of training phases have they been doing beforehand. So, and one of the reasons that this kind of training that's what I'm thinking is so effective for CrossFitters is because it's very different from what they've been doing previously. So if we apply something new to the system, we don't have to necessarily train as hard or as much to see an improvement. And when we start to see that the improvements they're starting to lack, we have to train very hard to get those adaptations. That's where we can start talking about doing a deload or changing the stimulus a little bit. But a typical hypertrophy phase, if we have a guy like, let's just use Andre as a example, who he has a lot of muscle mass and he's very strong and he's very neurological efficient. So I could sometimes I would just use a quarter split. So he only does quads, like specific hypertrophy quad work once a week. And for a lot of people that sounds pretty crazy, because there are some, we always talk about having a frequency of 2, maybe 2.5 for most muscle groups. But if you do have a session where you're doing heavy squat cleans for like 1,000 reps, as you do sometimes, one hypertrophy session is more than enough, or more would be too much. And he has something like, we would have like, we're talking Polikin, we have like an A series typically, where he does some a quad movement and a delt, some kind of delt movement. And then we would have some a B series and maybe a C series where he did more isolation work for shoulders, and maybe some even more quad work. And more specifically for hypertrophy training, we're trying to, now we haven't gotten into it yet, but this whole thing about trying to put the volume different places in the range. So as a CrossFit athlete, Andre hasn't done like a leg extension for years. He's used to doing barbell work that are always hardest at the bottom, like for quads, for example. So he's always doing lengthened work. Instead of putting more volume in that specific part of the muscle's contractile range, we were doing leg extensions so he could use more volume, get better using his quads, get a good pump, but it wouldn't affect his recovery as much as if I just started. Like sometimes I see someone doing barbell back squats and the accessory work is maybe like a goblet squat and some split squats and like basically the same exercises if we're looking at how they are challenging the muscles. So in a hypertrophy phase, we're trying to maximize mechanical tension and maximize getting it out in the entire range instead of just being in one place, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I got 2 questions that kind of spring to mind. The first question is, well, I guess it's more of a statement, but I think for a lot of folks in the CrossFit space, I think, well, firstly, we're limited by the equipment that we have available. Yeah. So we've typically got barbell, a pull-up bar, rings, dumbbells, and everything else you typically have. And I think with that, your movement selection immediately is a little bit more limited, which is why we see a lot of repetitive movement patterns. Like you said, we will go to the squat as our primary form for building, let's say, the quad. But what you're saying here is, there are other means that we can develop the quads. That's not necessarily going to take away from our ability to still squat in the week, but it's actually going to build a more well-rounded, let's say, quad muscle that's going to have, help bulletproof the body. So I guess this leads me into my next question, which is, for a lot of people, when they see hypertrophy style training, and I think this is probably what a lot of CrossFitters dislike about hypertrophy training, is they see slow contractions, they see sometimes partial range of motions. They think that they struggle to see the carryover from why hypertrophy work is going to benefit someone in a sport like CrossFit, where we're either having to lift really, really heavy loads, moderate heavy loads really, really fast, or just do a ton of reps really, really quickly. So, what is the validity for incorporating hypertrophy style training into, the training program for someone who's looking to get better at sport CrossFit?
Yeah. So there are a lot of misconceptions about like slow contractions and all that kind of stuff. Like I always love teaching for a new athlete, teaching them how to control like an eccentric. So I wanted to be like slow and controlled, not necessarily too slow, but controlled. But a concentric, I would never, the tempo would never be more than one. It's an explosive or an accelerated intent. If someone lifts a weight that they can lift fast, but they do it slowly on the concentric, you're learning the nervous system to be slow or weak, like doing co-contraction. So, for example, biceps curl slowly, but if you were to do that only with 5 kilos, you would just learn your nervous system to contract the triceps while doing the biceps curl, like too much. So that's just a misapplying the concepts. So if you don't look at the machines, just look at what the muscles are doing. In a leg extension, for example, it's doing knee extension. And what a lot of athletes and clients in general have a hard time doing is creating power through their quads in something like a squat. And something like quad weakness always sometimes gets the blame for something like lack of ankle mobility, for example, in a squat. Whereas my experience is often that they just don't have this capacity or the strength to load the quads and let the knees move forward. So just doing leg extension, hack squats, and some kind of heel elevated squats would help the strength in the quads and the nervous system know how to learn. They have learned to apply that strength in something like a squat. But you can make the argument that in beginners, I would just make them do a lot of squatting, so they get neurologically. They just from a motor standpoint, they learn how to do a squat. But if you have someone who knows how to squat, like someone like Andre, just doing specific strength work for something like if his quads were his weak area, that would automatically make him stronger in a squat when we get back to it. So I can see why someone looks at it like why hypertrophy style work would just seem like a waste of time if you're a CrossFit athlete. But it's because you're not really looking at it from an objective standpoint. Does that make sense for you?
Yeah, for sure.
What was the last part of your question? I forgot.
So well, I think it's like two parts. Firstly is like what's the benefit of adding hypertrophy work? Well, I think firstly, hitting finding other ways to train muscle tissue that isn't necessarily trained in the CrossFit setting obviously has carryover, because you're now just packing on more muscle and filling in holes in your armor, and that's going to transfer to big lifts like the sexy stuff like squatting and squat cleans, etc. But I guess, what other benefits are there for someone, exploring other movement patterns that you probably typically don't see in the CrossFit gym and incorporating hypertrophy style protocols?
So if for example, we use the quads again as a good example, it's very easy to comprehend and see if we are trying to make someone strong and we're applying a lot of volume for the quads. If let's say we have 10 working sets for quadriceps in a workout, instead of doing 10 sets in a squat-like movement, if we do 6 or 7 sets and then do 4 to 3 sets of leg extension, we're still training quad-specific strength, but you won't get as much muscle trauma-inducing volume. So you recover much faster and you feel better. And as a byproduct, you just get strong in that range too, which I can't see any downsides to being strong in your muscles in like the entire range. And one of the other very potent effects I'm seeing with other CrossFit athletes now is to just feel better when we adjust the volume a little bit more and do more, let's say, biomechanically optimal movements instead of everything being with a barbell. Because, and this sometimes it rustles some feathers saying that a barbell is a good tool for everything, but it's not really a great tool for specific things. Like it's just it's very one-dimensional. You can do every exercises, but you can't do every exercises perfectly if you're looking at it from a biomechanical standpoint. And if the body is not in a biomechanically optimal position, it's hard for the body to create a maximal output from the muscles that we're trying to train. So learning how to apply bodybuilding type movements and learning how to use the machines. I also see you have a leg press at your gym. You can learn how to get you teach your brain how to use the muscle fibers in specific muscle groups much more efficiently than you would be able to do in a freestanding barbell back squat, for example, which is like it's much more stable environment to create output from, and it feels great. You don't have as much you don't have to stabilize your spine and everything while doing it, which is not a bad thing. You have to be able to do that, but you're doing that in everything else you're doing. So just moving the volume a little bit around can make like big benefits to both your hypertrophy gains and how you feel inside and outside of the gym, and your recovery and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, something we've just invested in, a leg press, leg extension, and a hamstring curl, and a cable pull down, a cable row machine. We went with Watson's, and I remember those are three pieces of equipment I've always wanted to have in the gym. Firstly, we just haven't had the space to have it. We've just got an extension, so finally felt like we had the space to do it. And I put the order in January. And it took, I ordered it from the UK, so we were waiting for ages, and almost to the point where I almost forgot I'd ordered these pieces of equipment. And speaking to the rest of my team and our community to say, look, we've got three big pieces of equipment coming in this gym. We're going to have to make space. And the immediate kickback was like, we're not a Globo gym. Why are we getting a leg press? Like I've moved past those days. I'm now into the CrossFit space, and this is what I want to get into. But having the addition of those in the gym has actually been amazing. And a lot of the members, and I think some of the other advantages is that there are times perhaps the nervous system has just got nothing to give on a day. Perhaps life has gotten in the way, and you just don't feel like, or the body just doesn't want to put a barbell on its back or have to press a barbell on a bench press, and still having the option to challenge, the body and the tissue on a muscular level without having to get fired up, without having to, get yourself warmed up to get yourself into a perfect position to be able to squat is a massive advantage. So my next question then, Kasper, is, having worked with people in the CrossFit space now, what do you see the biggest mechanical and muscular deficiencies that we have as CrossFitters? Where are we specifically lacking strength? You talked a lot already about the leg extension and the quads, but looking at the rest of the body, what are you typically seeing?
Of course, it's very it's going to be a very generalized answer, but very often I see lacking hamstring strength, especially in a short position, like doing knee flexion. I've had guys who can deadlift 200 for almost 20 reps, not being able to do a lying hamstring curl with more than 30 kilos. So yeah, and that's like I call it low hanging fruits, just improving that capability to be able to bend at the knee joint. So it don't make sense that a guy that can maybe front squat almost 200 kilos won't be able to bend his knee with 30 kilos of resistance, because he needs that strength in the bottom of something like a squat. So I use my physical therapy classes and my experiences from working with rehab. Just when we do strength, something like the hamstrings in the short position, we do calf raises, all that kind of stuff. Try to incorporate everything, just getting strong in all positions around the knee and the ankle and the hip. Everything feels more stable in something like the bottom of a squat. And we don't see as much knee pain and knee irritation, all that kind of stuff. And the same goes for something like the elbows from doing curls, triceps extensions in a good setup in a cable or something. So lack of hamstring strength is what I see often. Like a lot of CrossFitters, they don't really have good hip hinging capabilities, and they're not very good at bending at the knee joint against the resistance, because it's not something you use a lot in the sport.
It's never tested.
No, but a stronger hamstrings are never it's never a bad thing.
Yeah, and I also think I completely agree. You know, when you actually break down what the bottom of the squat looks like, you know, the quad is in a lengthened position, the hamstring's in a shortened position. That's exactly the position that you're in a leg curl. And, you know, it's amazing how many people probably even actively without load can't pull their heel towards their butt and isometrically hold in a position that should look like a bottom of squat. If you kind of think about what's then happening in a squat, is essentially they don't have the muscular control to even be in that position, but gravity is just pushing them into it. And, you know, I think that's why, like you said, a lot of people deal with those issues. And I think with the hamstring specifically, without specific equipment like a hamstring curl, you know, some gyms have a glute ham raise. It's actually quite a hard position to actually train. And, you know, like a single leg glute hip up is not the same. A Swiss ball hamstring curl, ring hamstring curl is not the same. And, you know, even the glute ham raise, I think, you know, there's a level of prerequisite strength that someone has to have to even be able to do one in the first place. So I completely agree.
You don't really have a stable environment to build strength in the hamstrings when you only use GHD or something like a ring curl and banded curls and all that kind of stuff. So I think a lot of CrossFitters just give up on it because they don't have the equipment available. But then again, I have CrossFitters that they have their CrossFit gym, and sometimes they do a session in a global gym. Like, what's the issue in doing that? And more big gyms here, like CrossFit gyms here in Denmark, they have leg extension, leg curls, leg presses, a lot of different dumbbells and cables. But it is a normal challenge not being able to have so we have a lot of banded variations and all that kind of stuff just to work around it. But we're starting to see more and more investing in machines for the CrossFit boxes.
Yeah. What other deficiencies do you typically see, Kasper? So we talked about the hamstrings, we talked about the quads, specifically in leg extension.
Just all around strength in the muscles shortened position, like where they're in fully contracted position, or just the last part of like the short position. I've also had athletes who are like can squat a lot of kilos, but with 10 or 15 kilos on the leg extension, they can't get to terminal knee extension without throwing the weight. And again, just a few weeks of working with terminal knee extension strength, like something like knee pain and irritation improves massively. And it ties perfectly into what we know about how we have to treat something like knee pain from a biomechanical standpoint, is just getting strong and building up capacity throughout as much of the range as possible. And what we also see when we do that is what the athletes are telling me is they don't feel like they have to stretch as much, do like dynamic work and static strength, static stretches, such as couch stretches and hip openers and all that kind of stuff. So if from doing isolation work, getting strong in all the positions, they don't feel as tight like in the hip flexors and ankle joint and all that kind of stuff. So they get from doing that all the hypertrophy work, they don't have to do as much static stretching and specific mobility work in their warm-ups, so they can focus more on the workouts that they have to do.
Why is that? Why do you think that is, Kasper?
Like when we talk about you have often heard if you have tight hip flexors, instead of stretching, it's all about strengthening them.
Yeah, tight is weak.
Yeah, tight is weak. So if the nervous system, if the brain is not familiar with positions to feel strong in certain muscles, you tend to react with being weak. So and that can give you a sensation of tightness, not necessarily being tight, but it's just the nervous system not letting you get into certain types of positions. If we strength train positions like in the entire range, we don't have that problem. Then we can discuss doing sometimes barbell work that demands the body to be in a more biomechanically unfavorable position. Like CrossFitters and powerlifters, they have to be very strong in awkward positions that some physical therapists would be like, it almost looks dangerous, right? But it isn't. We have to build capacity all around. But a lot of the volume has to, in the way I do it, has to be, if you use exercises that are biomechanically efficient, everything just feels better. If we were to like someone like Andre, for example, we, instead of doing barbell presses, we had a whole phase of him just doing dumbbell press, where he was in a somewhat of an incline on the bench. So everything just aligned better with his shoulder joint and his anterior deltoid. So everything all started to feel better in his shoulder and his elbows. And then when everything started to feel good again, and he built up a lot of strength, we started to introduce the barbell again for his overhead press, and he made a new PR. And now we're starting to incorporate something like behind the neck presses and more awkward positions for his shoulders and elbows and that kind of stuff, just to build up the capacity again. So what we're doing with biomechanically optimal exercises is we're just getting the system we're just deloading all the stress a little bit while getting stronger, and then we can introduce all the more awkward and challenging positions on the load, just as we would if someone had like an overuse injury. It's not magic. It's just applying tension to applying load to build up capacity.
Yeah, and I think in the context of Andre, he's now just prepping for semifinals, so he has that probably in just a few weeks' time. So it makes sense to probably step away from the dumbbell work, move into more sports specific style of training, and then I would say more than likely when the season's over, he'll get straight back into doing something similar and kind of rebuilding himself again.
Yeah, we would probably start with a more like a hypertrophy kind of phase where all the exercises are more biomechanically favorable and more machine work and all that kind of stuff, and then we move into a strength phase with more and more specificity. But that doesn't mean that we have to do something like a barbell squat. I've had him doing only hack squats for 1 month without any barbell back squat work, and he still gets back to the barbell and gets even stronger. Of course, he has his squat cleans and his Olympic weightlifting sessions, which is something I talked with him in the beginning. Like, you don't have to do a lot of barbell work for your strength specific sessions, but for you're getting enough volume from your weightlifting session. So if you can power clean 160 kilos and squat clean 170, you're getting a lot of volume in that squat pattern under high speeds and all that kind of stuff. So applying even more squats on top of that, we could do it, but he wouldn't feel as great as he does now when we are doing more extensions and hack squats and split squats and all that kind of stuff. So just like looking forward instead of just applying what he has to do right now.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So the benefit of hypertrophy work before strength work. So kind of if you're looking at a season of an athlete, finishing the season and then starting a preseason with more hypertrophy work, and with the understanding that the hypertrophy work now is going to pay dividends down the line when you come into your strength training, because at the end of the day, a lot of CrossFit folks, all they care about is a 1 rep max and a 3 rep max and how much they can lift. And so I think often the approach is that as soon as the season finishes, I need to get straight back into my strength training cycle, because I now have 12 months to get as strong as possible. I need to be getting back to my 5s, my 4s, my 3s, my 2s, my 1s. Could you just quickly walk us through, why perhaps moving through a phase, you're focusing a bit more on hypertrophy, so slightly less intensity, more volume might be beneficial to improving strength long term?
Yeah. One of the ways you can look at it is you can look at the hypertrophy work as somewhat of a deload while you're actually improving, or you're getting more contractile tissue on your body. So when you get back into the strength work, you're like, there's a potentiation effect when you get back. So every athlete, every person has like this threshold of volume that is necessary to achieve the specific stimulus they're going for. So if you have been doing a whole lot of strength work, that threshold is very high. So you have to lift very heavy, and you won't be able to train with a very high frequency, for example. So doing a hypertrophy specific style of training puts you away from the specific stimulus you're going for. So you're deloading that system, so you can tolerate more hypertrophy work than you could neurological work. And when you've done that for 4 to 6 weeks, then we can start going into a more strength specific phase. But there are a lot of benefits also in terms of just having more mass on your body. Something like having bigger calves and bigger hamstrings at the bottom of a squat is something that someone like Andreas told me is a huge benefit for him. He doesn't have the feeling of it's just being bone on bone in the bottom of the squat. It's more like now it's muscle. He has to almost pull himself down because there's more muscle mass, and his muscles are more loaded and filled up, intramuscularly, with glycogen stores being high. So all that hypertrophy work, all that more focus on good contractions and short positioning work, getting a lot of glucose into the muscle, improves your from a local standpoint, improves your ability to generate more force from the muscles when you're doing the strength work. So we have this potentiation effect from the phases, and it can be less demanding from a psychological standpoint, not having to do these crazy high numbers day in and day out. But still, it's a struggle for me with new athletes. Like if I make a hypertrophy program with them, maybe doing a 10-10, 8-8, 6-6 in something like a hack squat or back squat, they're still training. Like if they can lift the weight, a CrossFit always puts more weight on. It's hard to, because I could do it. It's almost like a competition mindset for a max lift. You just put more on. But I'm trying to open up the idea to them that we just need the effective reps, and we're going to build up more and more effective reps in a workout or in a phase, and then you can train to maximal failure on maybe in the last week or the last 2 weeks of the phase, instead of just from the get-go.
Okay, so what does that look like? What does effective reps look like? If someone's working on a 10-10, 8-8, 6 rep scheme, what is effective reps and what is not effective reps?
So in terms of hypertrophy, what the science says is it's between 0 to 4 reps in reserve. And that's always, it's a subjective measure, but that's what we have to work with. So when the reps start to slow down, let's say it also depends on, are we doing a heavy hypertrophy phase, or are we doing more high rep hypertrophy phase? So let's say, for example, we're doing the high rep hypertrophy phase, the heavy hypertrophy phase, we would train with higher intensities. We wouldn't need as much volume. So we would have quite a lot of repetitions that were close to failure. So let's say the first set is we have 3 reps left in the tank. The next set we have 2, and then we have 2 and 1 and 1 and maybe 0 on the last one if it's the last week of the phase. There would be a lot of reps in the workout that were close to maximal muscular failure, because we're doing it in a machine. It's not technical failure like if we're doing it in a back squat where the brain can start to use fresh tissue as the glutes and shoot the hips back and all that kind of stuff. We're staying in the quads if you're doing let's say, for example, a hack squat. So we know that we're going to get a lot of mechanical tension in the quadriceps, because when we see the reps start to slow down, we have to grind a little bit more. That's when we're starting to incorporate all the fast twitch fibers instead of all the slow twitch. So that's what we can do with the heavy hypertrophy work, whereas when we're doing high rep, it's all that build up of the metabolic stress that forces the body to use more fast twitch fibers as the slow twitch fibers are starting to die out. Just like when you, like, it's extreme case of that would be like something like occlusion training or blood flow restriction, which we don't use, but that's just saying that's the extreme of where you can use light weights and still get that hypertrophic response. But the byproduct would be of the metabolic byproduct would be very high. So depending on who the athlete is, we're going to use more high rep or more the low rep scheme. So that's what a typical session would look like, something like 6 sets in a hack squat maybe.
And when we say we're leaving 0 to 4 reps in a tank, that's 0 to 4 perfect reps. So if you're moving to the point where compensation is taking place, let's say in that, if someone's using the squat as a hypertrophy protocol, and like you said, like the hips shoot back, the body's trying to recruit hamstrings, lower back and glutes, that would be in your eyes deemed as, okay, we're now moving away from the purpose of this exercise, which was to use the squat. In this case, perhaps for the quads, is that what you mean?
Yeah. So so in how I view a squat is like a barbell back squat. It's not a very good hypertrophy exercise because it's not very specific to any certain tissue. Yeah. We can on the first couple of reps, I can tell you try to move your knees forward. You can elevate your heels. Try to really load your quads. As soon as the quads start to get close to failure, no matter how hardcore you are, you're going to start to use more and more to the hips back and load the joints differently and therefore the muscles differently. So you would never get to anywhere close to like real muscular failure from your quads. Whereas in a hack squat, for example, it's almost impossible to cheat the weight up because there are some things we have to be concerned about. But basically speaking, I can get you to 0 reps back in the tank, and I can even go, let's say, a minus from using. I can help you. I can spot you. I can lower the incline on the hack squat, for example, so we can keep on. I wouldn't do that with a CrossFitter, but with a bodybuilding type client, you can keep prolonging the sets. You would never be able to do that in a back squat. It would just go from a quad dominant to a more like good morning style squat, which is fine, but it's just going to be more systemically challenging than only local. So we're starting to get that byproduct that we don't want. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears now. So we talked a lot about hypertrophy. Let's talk about the opposite end of the spectrum. So, we're talking about building absolute strength or top end strength. So the ability for someone to elicit a really heavy load, and let's say in a squat, a deadlift, or a bench press. What does that training protocol look like for you?
Like first and foremost, it's about choosing the right like the exercises for the job. And for me, it wouldn't. A lot of people, when they talk maximal strength, they automatically think about the barbell squat, the barbell deadlift, and the barbell press variations. But if you want to get specific strength, like neural adaptations in specific muscles or muscle groups, the same principle applies in being the more stable and the more specific the exercise can be, the better we're going to be at building strength in the muscles that we want to build. So a hamstring curl can be a strength specific exercise. It's just about how we are applying that tension, as we talked about in the beginning. And that sounds a little crazy when you say like a hamstring curl as a strength specific exercise, because most people see it as a supplementational exercise. But the program would be more geared against. We wouldn't go higher than 6 reps typically, and then the volume and the intensity would they are
inversely related.
Yes, exactly. So we could do anything from 10 sets of 2 to 3 down to 6 sets of 6 in something. But depending on how the exercise is, like the resistance profile of the exercise, we would choose more high or low reps. So again, using Andre as an example, we're doing a lot of hack squats, which are banded from the bottom and the top. So and with a lot of weight on. So the exercise is hard throughout the entire range of motion because the bands are giving him resistance at the top, whereas a normal back squat would only be hard in the bottom and the middle, and you wouldn't have a lot of tension in the last range. So we would tend to go down in a lower rep range than if we were to do back squats. So for I've had him doing like waves of 7-5-3 in a barbell back squat, but when we're doing hack squats, we are down to doing 3 or 4 reps for more sets, if that makes sense, because the volume is much more significant. You're going to get a lot of more tension out of each individual repetition by doing that kind of training.
So you're sorry, Kasper, continue.
Yeah, sure. No, it's let me
Yeah, I was just going to say, so, you're incorporating band work. And so for folks listening, what the band is changing the strength curve of the exercise. Whereas, barbell back squat at the bottom of the repetition is the hardest part of the squat. Now it's almost, if people to think about the barbell back squat, it's like you have to put a band on each end of the barbell, but attach the top of the band to the ceiling. So essentially the bottom of the squat becomes the easiest and it allows you to load more load into the top. So you're using that exercise to basically kind of fill in strength holes that Andre is not getting by just doing regular back squats as well?
Yeah, well, the bands have multiple purposes. So it's a little wrong to see it as making the exercise the easiest by banding it. So you should, if you put heavy weights on the CS hack squat now, while you go down, the band tension is going to start to build up as you get to the last part. So it's still going to be very heavy, but not as heavy as in the middle, because that band is not going to lift the entire weight for you. It's just going to smooth the strength, like the curve a little bit, like the resistance curve a little bit, so you don't feel like you're going to get smashed by the weight. The weight is not going to build up as much momentum, so you don't have to decelerate as hard as you would do with a barbell back squat. So that is a little bit easier on the knee joints, which is good when you train with very high volumes as a pro athlete. But it's also a good way to not build up too much mechanical trauma in the tissue. So the more hard eccentric or heavy eccentric stuff we do, the more mechanical damage we're going to build up, which is going to make you sore and you're going to make it very hard for you to recover for your next session. But the band will stop working when we get to the middle of the range, which is where the muscles are strongest. That's where the contractile tissue is in the best position to generate tension. And then the band for the bottom is going to start to get tightened. So you have something to, in Andre's example, explode and accelerate into. So we're teaching his nervous system to not only start very strong from the bottom, which he is extremely good at, but continue to recruit more fast twitch fibers while he's going up. So if you look at the way he squat cleans now and his squat, he's very efficient in just his squats. Quadsing he has a starting strength is very good, and his reactive strength is good at bouncing out of the hole, but he just keeps on getting stronger on the way up because his nervous system has gotten the ability to contract harder and harder throughout the concentric phase. And he has learned how to control how hard he contracts throughout, also when we train sub-maximally. So when he's doing his CrossFit sessions, he's even better at conserving energy now, or applying even more power when he has to do like a sprint, even in a long workout or in a short workout at the right moment, depending on his position or whatever in the workout. So that's something he's been telling me he's been very pleased with, is learning how to control how much power he's generating in different parts of an exercise.
I I think
So
that's such a cool observation that he's come out with, and I really feel that folks in the CrossFit space don't think about it enough. And I think kind of to put that into layman's terms, a lot of people, attack a 60 kg barbell the same way they attack a 100 kg barbell. And in
yeah,
a sport where you need to be as efficient as possible because you have to do a lot of repetitions, that the extra force that you apply to 60 kg barbell unnecessarily is just wasting
yeah.
valuable resources for you to be able to use later.
Andre is extremely cognitive and strategized in every single repetition he does. Not only one repetition, but the different phases in a repetition. So it's just also very motivating for me to see how we can start to apply that concept in his sport. So it's basically bodybuilding applied to CrossFit almost, which also kind of leads me into what you're talking about here. Is you always give 100% in every repetition that you do, even if it's 60 kilos. So going a little bit back to the hypertrophy kind of stuff where we are using like the RIR, keeping some repetitions in the bank while we're working. We don't go to total failure every time. I see a lot of CrossFitters doing very heavy work and just grinding the reps. Where since me and Andre have started working together, he hasn't been grinding one rep at all. He can save that for competition. So it may make his maximal strength a little bit better if we did more of it, but it's gonna come. But so I see him doing 175 in a back squat like it's zero weight on the bar, where some of his some other high-level CrossFitters from what I've been observing are doing maybe 180, but it's they're grinding the reps instead of being explosive and accelerating through the motion. So, and maybe they learn how to squat low bars so they can lift even heavier weights. So like some technique changes, which is going to make it even harder for them to recover from a neurological position, and all the quick forces that they do at the bottom is going to make more mechanical trauma to their muscles, so it's even harder for them to recover. So for me, it's very important that we look like a year ahead every time we're doing our periodization, instead of just, I'm going to lift as much heavy weight as I can each and every session. That will not make you feel good throughout the training season.
Yeah, I think the concept of sub-maximal strength training is something that most folks in the CrossFit space really have a hard time coming to terms with. And like you said, how many times you see in a typical CrossFit gym, folks like failing lifts at the start of a training phase, which really probably shouldn't be happening. And, even the concept of, reserving like your maximal efforts for when the season comes or for when you need it in competition time is not just important in terms of accumulating good quality repetitions, but like you said, making sure you're not overloading the mechanical or neural system too frequently. And it's probably one of the biggest reasons folks have to take more regular deloads, or, they have to adjust and adapt exercises in the middle of a training season because they just overloaded too quickly and too soon. And it is a pretty brutal sport just because of the movements you have to get good at. And so I think, kind of listening to all of this, you're proposing kind of a framework to go about still developing strength for when it counts, and in the long term by, just being a little bit smarter at how you kind of periodize and plan your training.
Yeah, exactly.
So, kind of I'm thinking now about a lot of people listening to this episode are probably in a pretty conventional CrossFit gym where they don't have access to a lot of the machines and stuff that, and we're really fortunate to have at Coastal. I know you have a lot at Nordic Performance Training, so what are some of the, what is some general takeaways that you think you can give folks in terms of that we're in where we are right now in the season is, we've kind of just finished the Open a couple months ago. We've got, 9 months ahead of us. And for most folks, getting strong again and packing on muscle is going to be a priority within the year. How can we implement some of the things that we've been talking about on this podcast into their training?
It's always going to be very challenging to load the muscles in the short position, like for example a hamstring curl and a leg extension, which we were talking about. But there are some some hacks we can use. I always, when I program to an athlete who doesn't have like every single exercise available, I always say, okay, we have the best exercise here. Let's say it's a leg extension. They won't be able to do a leg extension. What are the next best and the next best and the next best? Because we have to use something, and if it's not perfect, it can still be quite all right. So something like let's say for the quad, something like a sissy squat, which are banded like in an anterior posterior direction, can be quite okay. Like we can't load it with 100 kilos like we can in leg extension, but we can get some adaptations in the short position. With the hamstring curls, we can do like the ring curls you were talking about, but instead of having the feet placed in the rings, we can have our feet up on a bench, which is elevated, and you just hang in the hold on to the rings, and then you pull yourself. So you pull your buttocks all the way up against the bench. So it's almost like a leg curl. So it's more like a close range leg curl now because the feet is planted on the bench instead of being like more open chain and much more unstable in the rings.
I've literally
so that
never
little difference. That's a small difference that makes a big difference in the practical terms. So
that's awesome.
And then all the factors, like when you see like a hamstring curls in a global gym, you always see there's like like for the hip is in a little bit of flex position.
Yeah.
You have to reenact that when you do it, because if you're in a totally extended hip position, your hamstrings are going to be so weak because of active insufficiency. So being in a little bit of a hip, just like when you're doing a squat, if you're trying to stay completely straight, you don't have as much stability from the hips, and the hamstrings, for example, will not be able to generate a whole lot of force because they're too shortened to be able to. You won't get very strong. You're going to feel the hamstrings burn and cramp, but it's only a sensation. It's not a product of a lot of mechanical tension, so to speak. And you can use the glute ham raise. A lot of people have that available, and just band it from the bottom, like from the back, and you put it over your shoulders, and you can get more and more help by doing like a tricep extension while going up. That's a quite okay exercise, but still, as you said, you have to have certain degree of strength to be able to do it. Something like bands, you can do leg extensions with bands, but my experience is that most people, they do it for a few weeks and then it's too awkward, or it's too much of a hassle to set it up. So the sissy squat version, I actually think Andre, he made a post on No Shortcuts showing the exercise if anyone is curious, and a few tips on how to make it more comfortable in terms of not pulling on the skin and all that kind of stuff, because there are a lot of, when we don't have the optimal equipment and we don't really know how to set it up, when we don't have it, it can be a big hassle sometimes. That's why I think a lot of people, they give up on it. But yeah, you have to be a little creative if you don't have the equipment available.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I've been guilty of that in the past, when we didn't have the equipment, trying to find ways to mimic or create something similar. But like you said, probably just stopped after a few weeks because of the hassle in setting it up, or I think more in the back of my mind, just knowing that it wasn't as good as what I could have potentially had, which is such a stupid mindset, really. So I would use that as a reason to not do it altogether. But, just, I would highly recommend it if there's any gym owners out there, really do. I think it's highly worthwhile for your own health. And, for even just having the variance in your training, to invest in, the basics of something like a leg press, leg extension, hamstring curl, and some form of cable machine. It's made a massive difference to what we have here.
I'm really trying to open the eyes to a lot of people and athletes that you can use a bench press, like a leg press, to get stronger in your deadlift. Just showing that it's the same position we're placed in. Like it's the same vectors, it's the same muscles working, but it's a much more stable position. we're in. So if you know how to deadlift, you have the motor skills to do it. Getting stronger in a stable position can potentially make you stronger in something like a deadlift. And I'm not talking about like specialists in like powerlifting and that kind of stuff. I understand that they have to be very specific in the volume because the intensity is so high. But I really think it applies to CrossFitters and general population. Also, just giving people more options than just doing barbell work, because there are a lot of clients that come and they think they have to do a barbell back squat in order to train their leg strength. Some people, they love the barbell back squat, they're going to do it, but not everyone does. So just opening the eyes to several possibilities that will also make it more likely that people will return to the gym and keep training because we find something that they like. It's like on a lower level than if like someone like Andre, he doesn't care if you like it or not. It's just, if it's effective, he's going to do it. But just in a broader spectrum of getting people to work out and strength train. I think it's important not to be too focused on just this is the right thing. We have several options depending on your goals and your and what you like, your preferences.
Yeah, and I'll say to folks listening, like head over to your Instagram page, Kasper. I think you do a really good job. Even if it's all in Danish, you can still translate it. I've been doing that, but you're really good at providing visual representations of different ways to think about loading, different mechanical angles. I remember the post specifically that you put up using the leg press as a comparison to the deadlift in terms of the angles being more or less the same, just requires way less stability and you can get into the position way better. So yeah, I would really recommend that folks check out your Instagram page and have a look at the stuff you're posting. It's really good, mate. And so I think on that note, Kasper, it's probably a really great place to wrap it up. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I'm already been thinking about my own training and things I want to get incorporated into my training next week and make a little bit more use of the machines we now have. So thank you for kind of sparking a little bit more interest in me. For our listeners, where can we find out more about what you're doing?
Yeah, firstly, thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure. And I apologize for my sometimes lacking English skills, but you can find me at Instagram. It's my name followed by S, so it's Kasper Vinter. I don't know if you can put it down in the description. It's probably easier. And then we have our gym. It's Nordic Performance Training on Instagram. That's basically where we put everything up. And of course, you can head to our website, nordicperformancetraining.com, where you can apply for something like online programming if you're interested in trying it out for yourself. The specific type of programming that we tend to do also for CrossFitters, even if it's just like a way of supplementing something that you're doing, which are more CrossFit specific. Yeah.
Awesome. Kasper, thank you very much for your time, my friend. And thank you for sharing everything. Have a fantastic day.
Thank you. Yeah, you too.